I want to thank and welcome everyone who's arrived in this webinar um, so far. My name is Donna Secuta. I'm the Executive Director at the BC Labour Heritage Centre, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today on Vancouver women's labour history. I thought I'd give you a brief history of the walking tours, the labour history walking tours that the center here has been involved in over the years. I understand that there was a Centennial Labor History Committee for the city of Vancouver in its celebration of its 100th anniversary in 1986. And they actually produced a walking tour. I've never actually come across it myself. However, based on that tour, the first Vancouver labor history walking tour that was published that we're aware of was in 1994. And from that publication called Labor, Work, and Working People, a new tour and tour booklet was developed in 1986, or sorry, in 2013. And in 2018, the Labour Heritage Centre developed its walking tour app. And we did our first virtual walking tour in 2020 during the pandemic on the 85th anniversary of the On to Ottawa Trek. And as the Labour Heritage Centre is a provincial organization, we have added tours regularly outside of Vancouver, currently have tours written and published in Victoria, Prince Rupert, and Prince George. And we've also developed thematic tours around the Operation Solidarity Movement in 1983, the 1919 sympathy strikes to the Winnipeg General Strike, and of course the women's labor history. So this event is being recorded and will be
54
posted.
Chevy or Pontiac?
And
waving through.
If people have their microphones on, could they turn them off, please, or mute yourself so you're not interfering? I want to introduce you to Natasha Fairweather, who is our projects manager here at the center. She's been with us 6 months and is doing an absolutely incredible job. And I think you will really enjoy what she's put together for us today. So without anything further, welcome. And Natasha, take it from here.
Thank you so much, Donna. And thank you to everyone who's here. I'm really excited about today. I just loved putting together this presentation today. The material is so interesting. The photos are so amazing. And this is largely based on original research that was done by Janet Nickel and other volunteers at the center. And I hope that you enjoy it. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm glad that you are here as well. So let's first talk about where we are. So Vancouver is situated on the traditional unceded land of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Kakite, and Musqueam First Nations, who are among the many, many nations who've traveled and lived in this region and who still do. It's important that we recognize that these nations are not just people of the past, they're living communities today. What's also important is that we talk about what unceded land means. We always refer to this being unceded land, but what exactly does that mean? Starting in 1701, the British Crown brokered treaties with Indigenous nations in what we now call Canada. What we call the numbered treaties were negotiated and signed between 1881 and 1921. I'm in BC and I'm from BC, but I lived for 16 years in Treaty 7 territory. And so I have thoughts about the numbered treaties. Believe me, we could talk about the numbered treaties for an hour. But what I want to draw attention to today is the fact that most of BC is not covered by treaty at all. The colony of British Columbia wasn't able to negotiate many treaties, or didn't attempt to in some cases, but they just claimed sovereignty nonetheless. So the nations who inhabited this land made no agreements to share or give up any rights, and yet here we are. So why is this important to talk about? It's important context in all of the discussion that we're going to have today about International Women's Day. It's also important context just in terms of all of the history that we talk about on this land. We're going to be talking today about women's labor history in Vancouver. And an uncomfortable part of this is that we're often talking about people who fought for their own rights while ignoring or even fighting against the rights of others. And this may be uncomfortable, but it's true, and we need to recognize this. We know that just as the labor movement hasn't always seen women's rights as integral, although it does now, these movements have not always included racialized people, people of various gender or sexual expressions, people with disabilities, and other marginalized groups whose histories are every bit as important as the histories that we more often hear told. So at the BC Labour Heritage Centre, we really work hard to try to raise these voices in the historical record, and we've tried to do that today. So this is a walking tour, whether it feels like it or not, but we are on our way to the first stop of the tour. And so let's talk about International Women's Day. International Women's Day began in the midst of labor unrest in the early 1900s, not just in Canada and the US, but around the world. We've all heard of the Industrial Revolution, but this was such a huge time of rapid industrialization that it's often referred to as the Second Industrial Revolution. This was when large-scale factories, assembly line production, and time management became ruling economic forces. There was massive social upheaval. These changes in economic dynamics, they don't just exist in a bubble, they affect all of our other systems and institutions and dynamics. So as our economic forces changed, as we incorporated these large-scale factories, there was huge change in our understandings of family, gender, religion, social class, race relations, migration, all of these things, they're all connected. In one example, people went from working the land to working for wages, but only a few fields were considered appropriate for women workers. And there was a tension between whether it was appropriate for women to work versus whether families could survive without women working. Both of those forces were at work, putting people in very difficult circumstances sometimes. Some of the fields that were considered appropriate for women workers, at least for women workers of certain classes or certain races or certain ages or family statuses, were fields like nursing, teaching, being a telephone operator, sewing. And even in these fields, it was usually the lower ranks that were more acceptable for women to be in. So clothing production, as one example, went from something that women typically did at home as needed for their own families to something that happened in factories in the cities. And conditions in garment factories were miserable. Poor ventilation, long days, cramped spaces, low pay, work-related illnesses and injuries were common, and women workers knew they were being exploited. But of course, then as now, there were always people working to make things better. So in 1908, 15,000 women who were members of the Socialist Party of America protested in New York City for better conditions, better pay, and the right to vote. In 1909, they held the first National Women's Day in the US. In 1910, same time period, socialist women in Europe, Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg, in this picture that you see here, started organizing the first International Women's Day event, which happened the next year in 1911. More than 1 million people attended rallies in Germany, Denmark, Austria, and Switzerland, demanding equal rights and protesting discrimination. Now, if you've heard anything about the garment industry in this particular time period, you've likely heard about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. This happened 1 week after this million-strong International Women's Day protest in Europe. This drew even more attention to the inhumane conditions that women workers, largely immigrants, were forced to endure in the garment factory. So all of this is happening. All of this is percolating up in the culture. And these circumstances led to the coalescing of a movement that demanded economic security and social equality for all. Took a little while, but eventually March 8th was designated as International Women's Day, which is when we still celebrate it, recognize it, honor it today. It's common now to see International Women's Day as a day to post on social media about how much you love your mother, which I do, or how much you look up to certain historical figures, which I look up to many. These are really lovely sentiments, of course, but it's also important to remember the socialist women who started this movement to build solidarity and to expand social rights among the working class. Today, we also recognize the intersection of labor rights with the rights of trans people, racialized people, incarcerated people, and other marginalized and oppressed peoples. A rising tide lifts all boats, right? If we expand social rights among the working class, everyone benefits. But this is a walking tour, so let's see where we are. Here's a map to help us establish our location. We are right in downtown Vancouver, a collection of physical locations, all within a few blocks. Of course, we're going to use these locations as jumping points to tell stories that affect all people in British Columbia. So we're going to head over to stop number 1, Cathedral Square, and we're going to get started. And I'm just going to give you a heads up. I've got videos at each stop that were conducted on a pretty windy day. So if you're wearing headphones, you're going to hear that wind. You might need to adjust your volume. Bonjour, hello. We're here at Cathedral Square, named after the Holy Rosary Cathedral, which it faces. Constructed for Expo 86, this park became part of a collaborative art project called Blanketing the City in 2021. Coast Salish master weavers from the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations designed the patterns we see painted on the concrete cylinders around the park. You catch a little glimpse of those cylinders from the video, but this photo is from Vancouver Mural Fest, and it's just stunning, just absolutely stunning. I'm a textile artist, and I just love the weaving patterns that are painted on these giant industrial cylinders. I think it makes such an incredible statement. But here at Cathedral Square, we're going to talk about Indigenous First Nations women in the fishing industry. So the fishing industry along the Burrard Inlet and Fraser River provided work for many Indigenous women long before Vancouver was a city, and continued to do so into the 1970s. Women were often employed at canneries, where they worked in assembly line style environments, cleaning and preparing fish. These canneries were located all up and down the coast, and women would often travel in or travel out from their home communities to work at the canneries for the busy periods, right? Fishing is very much a seasonal activity, and so women would travel to the canneries to work their hands off when it was busy season. Josephine Charlie was a member of the Squamish Nation born in 1898, and she worked in the fish canneries for many years. Here she describes what it was like in the 20s and the 30s.
Oh, we'd work from 7 to sometimes midnight. Oh, we'd work, and the woman on the line worked till 1 o'clock as the line's going, you know, and the ones cooking would be there till 2 or 3 in the morning, and we'd work all hours from then on. That's the sockeye season, and then the pinks come in. That's where we pretty die. They come by the thousands. Sometimes one sailing boat would get 20,000, 30,000. You could see them come around the pond just like if they were swaying, you know. They're so full of fish. Oh, we're all grown.
This little clip is from an incredible oral history interview that was taken by Sarah Diamond in 1978. We're so fortunate to have these incredible recordings to tell us about life in the 1920s and the 1930s and the voices of the folks who actually lived them. Josephine Charlie was an incredible woman. She was active in the Native Brotherhood Union, and she later became a steward in the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union. This was one of the photos that I used to promote this presentation. This is just such an incredible photo. In the summer of 1954, racist signs on the women's washrooms at the Namu fish cannery divided the facilities between whites and natives. The signs had been there for years, but despite demands from the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union and the Native Brotherhood of BC, despite both of these unions demanding that the signs be removed, management took no action. So finally, August 1954, the workers held a joint meeting of the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous women, and 154 members who attended the meeting voted unanimously to do away with the signs. They knew that management wouldn't do it, so what did they do? They took the signs down themselves. It was a small step in the long march to overcome racism and ethnic divisions in BC's fishing industry. For more on ethnic divisions in BC's fishing industry, we have an incredible podcast on our site about T-Buck Suzuki, the Japanese union organizer and fisherman. The boat in the photo is the Texada, which was a fish packer run by BC Packers. It traveled between Namu and Bella Coola. I mentioned that women would travel from their home communities to work in the canneries during high seasons. That was the case this summer, and the UFAWU tendermen were on strike at the time. So without any sort of special consideration, these women would have been stuck at the cannery, unable to get back home. BC Packers got an agreement from the striking tendermen to make a special trip so that the Bella Coola women who had come to Namu to work could return home for the duration of the strike. The women brought with them the objectionable signs they had earlier removed from the cannery washrooms. And one of these signs is actually in the David York Labor History Collection held at SFU. There it is. All right, let's head on to our next stop, just down the block a couple of buildings, the Labor Temple. The Labor Temple was built by and for trade unionists, opening in 1913. The building included meeting halls, a billiards room, a low-cost cooperative store, and offices. It was the physical heart of labor in Vancouver until it was sold to the provincial government in 1921. The building served many purposes through the years, including as a technical school, and the original facade was covered up. A more recent renovation uncovered the original hand-carved sign you see above me today. The building is now home to a variety of businesses and a couple of union locals. So in this era, most trade unionists were men. There were some women who were trade unionists, but as I said, women weren't in the workforce to this extent that we are today. The women who were involved in unions tended to be laundry workers, waitresses, lady cooks, telephone operators, and in some cases, domestic workers. In 1918, the Vancouver Labour Council led Canada's first general strike to protest the shooting of Labour activist Ginger Goodwin on Vancouver Island. This is a whole big story all on its own. But what we need to know for this story is that Ginger Goodwin was shot and killed on Vancouver Island. There was the general strike to protest this, and about 300 returned war veterans stormed the Labor Temple in opposition to the strike. They attacked labor leaders, they vandalized property, they pushed the Labor Council Secretary Victor Midgley out onto a window ledge. They beat the crap out of him and pushed him out onto a window ledge. They were trying to push him off the ledge, potentially. The temple's switchboard operator, Frances Foxcroft, stepped in and saved him. She put herself between Victor Midgley and the rioters who were trying to push him off the ledge. For her efforts, union business agents and officers presented Frances with an amethyst and pearl pendant. Frances Foxcroft told them, "I would have done the same thing for any of them in similar circumstances." Frances Foxcroft, what a hero. She was a union member and she belonged to the Telephone Operators Union. The BC Telephone Company, BC Tel, now TELUS, was just a few blocks away from here at 555 Seymour Street. It was staffed by female switchboard operators who were known as Hello Girls. At this time, every single phone call that was placed needed to go through operators. So they were essential. They were absolutely integral to this system. In 1919, the Winnipeg General Strike rocked the country. The Vancouver Labour Council led a sympathy strike and the telephone operators joined in. Since all telephone calls required an operator, this action of the operators being on strike had a big impact. As all of the workers returned to work, the telephone operators were the last group to return to work. The Labor Temple, as I said, it was the heart of labor in Vancouver for a number of years, and many labor leaders made their mark at the Labor Temple during its time on Dunsmuir. One of the most influential was Helena Guttridge. Ooh. Helena Guttridge was a British tailor and an activist, and she came to Vancouver in 1911 on a mission to spread the suffrage movement. She called for votes for women at the Labor Temple, which was a significant action, given that the suffrage movement at the time was dominated by middle-class, not working-class women. In the BC election of 1916, the government put the election of white women's vote to a referendum, and a majority of voters responded in favor. The following year, the government passed legislation giving white women the franchise. Guttridge then turned to labor organizing. She fought for women's employment and equal pay. She organized a toy-making cooperative in Vancouver that employed hundreds of people. In her early years, she reflected the prevailing social attitudes with racist positions that supported white women over Chinese and other racialized women. She eventually separated from her husband, joined the CCF, which is the precursor to the NDP, and in 1937, Helena Guttridge won a seat on Vancouver City Council and became Vancouver's first councilwoman. In her political career, she advocated for the employment of married women, which was controversial at the time. She supported extending suffrage to non-white women. She fought for the right of Asian people to be able to get business licenses. And what she is most remembered for today is that she developed a social housing plan despite strong opposition. She finished her career as a social worker at the Japanese internment camp in Lemon Creek. We are on our way to our stop number 3. Just a couple blocks away is Victory Square. The Victory Square Cenotaph was built in 1924 to commemorate the lives lost by Canadian soldiers in the First World War. Every November 11th, war veterans and others gather to remember the fallen. In more recent years, the contributions of Canada's nursing sisters from both the First and Second World Wars have also been recognized. I hope I'm not talking too fast or moving too fast through things. I will let you know that at the end, we'll have a chance to chat and you can ask questions or you can add context. I know we have some experts who are here in this presentation with us today. And so at the end, I'd be happy if anyone has stuff to add in or any questions. So this photo here, we don't know exactly what year this photo was taken, but we do know that it was very shortly after the cenotaph was built. It shows a very different Vancouver than the one we know today, although in some ways it's definitely still recognizable. Many labor activists in Vancouver opposed the First World War. They called it a class war and not Canada's war to fight. Similarly, many of the dissenters to the Second World War were also connected to the labor movement. One Vancouver peace activist was Mildred Farney. She was born in 1900 in Manitoba, and she came to BC as a teen. She had a typical education, a typical career until 1930, when she was invited to study at Kingsley Hall in London, where Mahatma Gandhi was also in residence. Mildred and Mahatma Gandhi struck up a lifelong friendship, going for many walks together, talking about philosophy, talking about politics, talking about the world. Farney credited Gandhi with changing the course of her life. which became dedicated then to peace and to what we today would call anti-oppression work. She was a pacifist and a socialist. She became friends with Martin Luther King Jr. She was a volunteer teacher at Japanese and Doukhobor internment camps, and she was an internationally renowned speaker. She's a legend in peace activism. She lived her whole life in Vancouver, and she died in Vancouver in 1992. Women were not permitted to serve in combat duty in World War II, but their labor was still necessary for the war effort. Women's labor has always been necessary to make society tick. During wartime, women worked in munitions factories, shipyards, and other non-traditional jobs. And a significant number of women were active in trade unions during the wars, including about 1,000 women who worked at the North Vancouver shipyards. Johnny Rankin was born in 1916 and worked as a riveter during the Second World War. In this excerpt from her 1978 oral history interview with Sarah Diamond, she talks about what it was like to work with men and what working meant to women's lives.
We were very much accepted after they got used to the idea, and they liked to work with women, and everybody learned something. It was an education, and mostly women. They learned to, see, most women were so dependent all your life on a man's salary. It was a tremendous thing to earn your own money.
Yep.
And a lot of marriages, some broke up over it because she wasn't going to go back and ask anymore. Another one, a lot of them were better because the man understood her more as a partner. I worked in the deep tanks when I was a riveter, and I was slimy. You know, I used to hang off the back of the speaker. I wouldn't even let me sit down on it. And say, I can't understand why you like to do this. And they couldn't understand, besides getting the money, we were sort of buying back our self-respect.
Yeah.
And that's something none of those men really understood. And I don't think they understand it today.
I just love that clip. Buying back our self-respect. What a speaker. If we look right across the street from where we are now, we can see the Hamilton Block. So let's head on over to stop number 4. Today, this brick building at Pender and Hamilton is a designated heritage site with office and retail rentals. In the city's early years, garment workers, mostly immigrant women from Europe, toiled long hours within the brick walls. Some garment workers in the city organized into the Journeyman Tailors Union as early as 1893. The sign, Pappas Furs, with an entrance at 449 Hamilton Street, is the only reminder of a small family business manufacturing and selling luxury furs on this block. So Helena Gutteridge, who we spoke about earlier, was one of these organizers of the Journeyman Tailors Union. Now, when I tell you I fell down a rabbit hole researching the garment industry, you got to believe me. This was just really fascinating to me. So Universal Knitting, which you may have seen the building, you may have heard of this, it opened in Vancouver in 1914. It produced sweaters, coats, and swimwear, and it was proudly British Columbian. On all of their advertisements, all over the newspaper, they always really talked about how important it was that they were British Columbian. And for many years, it shared this building with the Vancouver Daily Star. The newspaper occupied the bottom 2 floors and the knitting mill the top 2. So I'd just like you to imagine for a moment working in a factory with heavy equipment, with all of the sounds, with all of the smells, with all of the crowding that would be, and you're in what's basically the top 2 floors of a downtown building with brick walls, with the kind of windows that would have existed in 1914. That cannot have been a very pleasant place to be operating these machines, to be working. Women sat in long rows and they worked as machine operators and finishers, while men had jobs as knitters and supervisors. In 1924, the company got the right to produce swimwear for Janssen, and so they had 2 sections of the company going at the same time in the same facility, Universal Knitting and the Janssen side of production. They soon found their facilities completely inadequate. They needed more space. The two sections of the company reincorporated under just the Janssen name in 1927 and moved to a new purpose-built facility at 196 Kingsway. You might recognize this building. It stayed in business looking much like this into 1997. Although in 1935, right in the middle of the Depression, sorry. Oh, I lost it. Yes, 1935, halfway through the Depression era, employees did organize into a union. So this building stayed like this, looking much like this, until 1997 when Janssen closed the factory. We're going to stay on the topic of the garment industry, and we're going to go just a few blocks away to continue this story. What Janssen was to swimwear, Marjorie Hamilton was to ladies' wear. The factory operated at several locations through the years, but for many years it was here at 318, now 320, West Cordova. So Marjorie Hamilton, this might be a familiar brand to some. It certainly was to me. In 1944, Marjorie Hamilton was a Vancouver housewife, a young wife to a Royal Canadian Air Force sergeant who was away at war. During wartime, it wasn't possible to buy glamorous things like lingerie. So Marjorie, who had no previous sewing experience or business experience, started making glamorous lingerie out of fabric remnants and giving them or selling them to her friends and neighbors. When her husband Bill returned from war, he saw how much she loved it and also how successful she had been. And so the two of them committed to developing this business. And Marjorie Hamilton became one of Vancouver's big post-war success stories. And if you research at all Canadian fashion or Canadian garment history or textile history, Marjorie Hamilton is one of those big names. By 1949, they already had 35 employees operating electric machines at a factory on West Pender. There was a disastrous factory fire, though. Factory fires were not unheard of in this time, and it almost ended the business in 1954. But Marjorie and Bill persevered, and they expanded, and they moved into this location at 318 West Cordova, right in Gastown. By the late 1950s, they were starting to move away from lingerie and into dresses. And many of these you can find today in vintage clothing collections and for sale online. If you are at all interested, I suggest that you search online. There's some gorgeous dresses that you can see or that you can buy from vintage clothing sellers. Marjorie Hamilton, what she was really a pioneer in was the brand new leisure wear category, which she helped to invent. She spread the West Coast casual lifestyle through Canada and internationally. But what was it like to work in the Vancouver factory? What was the garment industry like in the 1960s? Well, until the 1960s, most garment workers were European women, but from the 60s to today, they are predominantly Asian women. The industry typically employs new immigrants and other vulnerable workers who might not have the Canadian language or legal knowledge to be able to advocate for their rights. Some exploitative sweatshop owners pay employees under the table to dodge taxes. And so in 1985, the province reported on sweatshop conditions at a number of Vancouver garment factories. Complaints varied from wage theft to verbal abuse, physical abuse. The Chinese Benevolent Association launched an investigation themselves, saying that Chinese women were singled out for abuse at work, but were too afraid of retaliation to make public claims. The staff at Marjorie Hamilton in 1985 was about 200 workers. 95% of them were Chinese. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGW, agreed that Marjorie Hamilton was one of the better shops, but even as one of the better shops, Marjorie Hamilton was still reported to the BC Human Rights Council for age discrimination. The factory had laid off a number of older workers, while at the same time advertising help wanted in Chinese language newspapers. They were found liable in several of the cases and forced to pay a fine. Also in 1985, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union launched an organizing drive at Marjorie Hamilton. This was its first organizing drive in 40 years. The employer responded by offering their own benefits package, and this 1985 drive failed. The union tried again in 1986, and after a hotly contested vote, both sides contested votes, they had to send it to employment standards to adjudicate, but the union did win. Of course, winning is not the last step, as we know. It still took 2.5 years to reach first contract. And when they did reach first contract and they held the ratification vote, 4 union members, four employees came to vote. As the newspaper reported, the rest of the staff were too afraid of employer retaliation to attend the union meeting. Today, most garment workers in Canada are not unionized. In 1995, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union merged with other clothing unions and later with hospitality unions to form what is now the union Unite Here. There are some garment workers who are unionized, but not anything like it used to be. So let's head back to Victory Square, which used to have a branch of the Canadian Bank of Commerce right across the street. In 1950, a branch of the Bank of Commerce was built on the north corner of the Hamilton block, with an entrance on Hastings Street. 65 years later, it was demolished to make way for a film school. Known as the Victory Square branch, the Commerce Bank was the scene of a historic union drive in 1976. Bank tellers and other floor-level staff at the time were predominantly women. Due to a legal loophole, because banks were federally regulated, bank management was allowed to assign compulsory unpaid overtime to the staff, and there was very little that the workers could do. The Service, Office and Retail Workers Union of Canada, SORWUC, wanted to change that, and conveniently, they had an office right across the street at the Dominion building. At the BC Labour Heritage Centre, we have an oral history project where we collect the stories of people at the heart of the BC Labour movement. One of our interviewees, Jackie Ainsworth, was involved in this story. So let's hear the story in her words.
The Service, Office and Retail Workers Union, SORWUC, was small, grassroots, and overtly feminist. It specifically sought to organize women in occupations that were typically ignored by the established unions. Jackie Ainsworth had been working at the CIBC Victory Square branch for about 3 weeks when she learned that her colleagues were looking to take action against the unpaid overtime and favoritism they were subjected to.
And then, of course, I raised that I thought we should join a union. And everybody said, oh, yes, that's probably a good idea, but that's impossible. That's just ridiculous in terms of, how big CIBC is. And that was just a fantasy. And so I got home and called up Jean and Melody, and we met and we did up a leaflet saying why bank workers should be in a union, and they leafleted my branch the next morning. And just so it wouldn't look super conspicuous, they leafleted several branches on West Hastings there. A couple women in my branch really got interested in the idea. And so they started coming to SORWUC meetings. And again, we talked about the whole thing about, did SORWUC have the resources to take on the banking industry? And we were convinced that in order to organize an industry the size of the banking industry, that we needed to have new organizing strategies. We talked to so many union reps, whether it was in office and technical employees or in hotel and restaurant or in retail clerks, and they just didn't understand our issues. We just felt that it needed to be a whole new kind of union and a whole new kind of union organizing.
In 1977, the Canadian Labour Relations Board made a landmark ruling. Bank workers could organize branch by branch, rather than requiring employees all across the country to sign up together. This was a major win for SORWUC.
Previous to that, bank workers didn't think they had the right to unionize. We were told by management we didn't have the right to unionize because of how important the banking industry is. So we were told we couldn't unionize. So in that way, it was a really important decision.
You can see the rest of that oral history video on our slide if you're interested. So from 1972 to 1986, Sorwak organized bank workers, restaurant workers, childcare workers, and more. They trained a generation of women union leaders, and they showed that you didn't have to be a big international organization to be able to make a mark. In 1986, they disbanded, and many of their members merged into other unions. Let's head on over to our next stop. The Sun Tower was built in 1912 by the owner of the Vancouver World newspaper. The building was originally called the World Tower. In 1937, the Vancouver Sun newspaper bought the property and changed the name to the Sun Tower, a name that remains to this day, despite the newspaper moving its operation to South Granville Street in 1964 and later to Granville Square. The Sun Tower is one of the really iconic buildings in downtown Vancouver. It used to be that you could see it wherever you went, and now you still can see it, like it still rises above. I love looking through old historic photos of Vancouver and being able to recognize where the photo must have been because of the Sun Tower in the background. So it used to be the tallest building around. Now there are taller towers, but this one is definitely still iconic. Most journalists at the time were men, but there were women making their mark in the journalism industry early on. Doris Milligan was a journalist at the Vancouver Sun for several years, starting in the 1930s. She was also a key local organizer with the American-based Newspaper Guild. Mamie Maloney Boggs, a Sun columnist, was also a guild organizer. By the early 1940s, Doris, Mamie, and other guild organizers succeeded in signing up a majority of employees into the union. Interviewed about the drive years later, Doris said, "We used to have meetings at nighttime, sometimes in people's homes. We paid for our own meals. We never got any honorariums or anything. We just worked our heads off for the union. But at that time, it was very much needed." Sun employees today are still in a union despite ongoing upheavals in the newspaper industry. Today, these journalists are represented by Unifor Local 2000. Our next stop is just around the corner. The Lotus Hotel. Up until the Second World War, sex workers operated out of brothels within the town's informal red light district, which ran from Alexander Street to Pender Street. The Lotus Hotel bordered this district. Since opening in 1912, the hotel's name hasn't changed, but its services and reputation have. So this photo from 1918 shows the Lotus Hotel, or the Hotel Lotus. In the 1930s, the hotel basement was rented as a club. Hostesses were hired to drink tea here while male customers paid for rum and scotch. By the late 1940s, the local newspapers reported shootings on the premises, along with illegal liquor sales and bookmaking activities, gambling. In later decades, the Lotus Hotel was known for its popular bar and dance club, and today the building contains low-rent single-room occupancy units, SRO units, on the upper floor, and a bar and other businesses on the ground floor. So you can still go and have a drink or some tea at the Lotus Hotel. Older white women typically owned the early brothels in the district around the Lotus Hotel. Sex workers at the time were from diverse racial backgrounds, and we know this from the publicly accessible police records of the period. Of course, the only time many of these women show up in photographs is in police records. Ardell Warren, a 26-year-old white woman, was working at a brothel at 666 Alexander Street when the police conducted a raid on October 30th, 1912. According to the police record, she was an American with no prior convictions, and she was found guilty of being an inmate at a disorderly house and sentenced to 6 months in jail. Also arrested in that brothel raid was Mary Scott, charged as a keeper of a bawdy house, B-A-W-D-Y, a bawdy house. Mary was a 56-year-old white woman originally from the United States, and she had a previous record of keeping a house of ill fame for many years in Prince Rupert, BC. She was sentenced to 6 months and a fine of $202. There were many other women who were arrested in this brothel raid and in other brothel raids throughout the time. Not far from here is our next stop. the building where the White Lunch restaurant used to operate.
The White Lunch at 65 East Hastings Street, now long gone, opened in 1913. It was one of 4 White Lunch cafes in the city, famous for its neon signs and affordable food. The restaurant chain reflected a city divided by racism, as its very name, White Lunch, suggests. Only white people were hired, and only white people were served.
This is just such a beautiful, beautiful photo of the White Lunch cafeteria. The all-white concept was very popular at the time. This place, the White Lunch, was opened with the concept that white people would want an all-white place to eat. This concept was very popular. Anti-Chinese, anti-Japanese sentiment were very high. The company eventually opened 4 locations. They were known for their bright neon signs. In 1937, the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union started organizing the staff, who were mostly women, at White Lunch. There was strong management opposition. Eventually, one of the employees was fired for her union activity, and the staff at all 4 locations went on strike to support her. They believed that they would have widespread support because they catered to the working class customers, and the working class understood the need for unions. In fact, they were right. Many customers refused to cross the picket line, and just a few weeks later, there's reporting that the strike was won. The union won recognition, they established the legal right to picket, and 3 employees who had been fired for their union activity were reinstated. This was a major win. It continued to be an uphill climb, however, with the company using union-busting tactics. Like, we have a newspaper clipping of a company union that was started at White Lunch, and all of the executives in the company union are White Lunch managers. So they did what they could to try to bust up the legitimate union. Over time, White Lunch let go of its racist policies as society was changing, and that all-white concept was not necessarily as popular. By the 60s, there are reports that, let's see, I listened to an interview of a Chinese man who said that he didn't experience racism when he went in there in the 60s. So we don't know exactly when things changed. It doesn't look like there was an official policy change. It's just that changed over time at the White Lunch.
The iconic sign still hangs above the Army and Navy department store at 27 West Hastings Street, despite the century-old retail outlet closing its doors in 2020. In 1949, women employees took a historic stand here against their employer.
So Army and Navy was a Vancouver institution. It was started by Sam Cohen in 1919, and it became Canada's very first discount department store. For 101 years, it was a family-run business until it shut its doors for good in 2020. They cited the COVID-19 pandemic as one of the major reasons. Over 101 years, though, there were lots of stories that happened there. In 1949, employees of the new Westminster branch of Army and Navy went on strike. Their union, the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Employees Union, had won a conciliation board ruling against the store, and the store refused to implement it. So basically, the employees had taken their employer to like get a labor arbitration, and they had won the ruling that they should be allowed union security. They should be allowed a big raise. I'm sorry, I'm just losing my words here. And even though this ruling came out in favor of the employees, the employer just refused to implement it. So staff at the new Westminster branch struck for improved wages and better union security. And this picture, I love it so much. Yes, Army and Navy does pay less. You know, all of these beautiful, stylish young workers. And on the far right here, there's someone in a monkey suit with a sign that says, "I can live on peanuts," but Army and Navy employees can't. Army and Navy on strike. Staff at other Army and Navy stores picketed to support their fellow employees. 6 months later, the strike was still ongoing. The BC Federation of Labor approved a levy of 5 cents a week from each of its 30,000 members to support the New West strikers and raised more in pledges from the floor at its convention. The IWA also applied a levy to support the strikers. Almost a year in, City Council and the mayor got involved at the union's request. The union had not been able to make any headway. The employer just refused to engage. And so they got City Council and the mayor to try to make contact with the employer to find a resolution. And yet this strike continued. It went on for 16 months. And 16 months after the strike began, it ended unceremoniously. The union ended the strike December 30th, 1950. It remains one of the longest strikes in BC history. Provincial legislation passed in 1958 recognized the principle of equal pay for equal work, but male employees at Army and Navy still received higher wages than women for performing the same jobs. Workers organized a successful protest against this inequity. With the help of the labor movement and women's groups, they carried out sidewalk protests that shamed the employer into respecting the law. So workers at Army and Navy have a long history of standing up for their rights. All right, it's a little bit of a walk to our last 2 stops, but it is worth it. We're going to walk on over to Chinatown. The Yik Fung Tea House operated on the 2nd floor of this building at 137 East Pender. It was one of 6 tea houses in Chinatown during the interwar years. Each tea house had 4 or 5 female employees who worked long hours, sometimes 7 days a week. This photo is from Pender Street, and it's from around 1929. So the first Chinese women immigrants came to BC as early as 1858, but most arrived around the turn of the 20th century. Some came as concubines for merchants, that is, second and third wives. Others immigrated to marry poor husbands. They had to pay off the cost of their passage, and they often worked at laundries or as seamstresses and dressmakers. Lillian Ho Wong was born in Vancouver's Chinatown in 1895. She was born here. But she came of age during the Chinese Exclusion Act era, where there were very limited financial and social options, but a strong community that was determined to build both a Chinese and a Canadian identity. I love this photo so much. You see in this photo Lillian working at a millinery shop around 1919 after the end of her first marriage. Lillian Ho Wong has a really interesting story. And if you're interested, there's a great oral history interview with her nephew on YouTube, conducted by a master's student from Queen's University. Lillian Ho Wong became a fashion icon in Chinatown, Vancouver's Chinatown. And here she is working in a millinery shop. She had some options. She was born in Canada to a family that owned a business, but some Chinese women and girls were trafficked to Vancouver to be married or to work as maids or in other low status occupations. One such occupation was as a stand at table girl in a tea house. And so this photo shows us the Yik Fung tea room. And look, there's the Sun Tower in the background. So the Yik Fung Tea Room operated on the 2nd floor of this building at 137 East Pender. It was one of 6 tea houses in Chinatown during the interwar years. I don't have a good picture of it in that time period, but it was still around here. Each tea house had 4 or 5 female employees who worked long hours, sometimes 7 days a week. They endured scorn and social exclusion. Many families would never permit their daughters to work these sorts of jobs, waiting on men and encouraging them to drink and spend money. Denise Chong's family memoir, The Concubine's Children, tells the story of her grandmother, Mei Ying. She was under contract to the Pekin Tea House in Vancouver's Chinatown, working 2 years to pay off her debt for the cost of passage to Canada. Quote, "The tea house women were expected to dress up," Denise wrote, "wear elaborate makeup, and entertain men with conversation and flattery. It was a tall order, and they were open to sexual exploitation and economic and social uncertainty." Denise also noted some tea house women ran away or left one man for another. Some women suffered physical abuse, and unwanted pregnancies were common. Of course, white Vancouverites at the time blamed the Chinese community for these social ills, but if we consider the fact that racist and sexist laws gave Chinese women very few options, we can see where the real blame for this suffering should be placed. And moving right along, it turns out a walking tour goes faster when the walking's already done. Let's head on over to Black Strathcona.
Vi's Chicken and Steakhouse operated in a building once standing at 209 Union Street. It was a go-to music joint run by Vi and Bob Moore for 31 years. Vi's restaurant was part of Hogan's Alley, an enclave of Black residents within the Strathcona neighborhood, running from Park Lane to Jackson Avenue and between Union and Pryor.
Vi's Chicken and Steakhouse operated in a building once standing at 209 Union Street. So the building is not there anymore, but that space is still recognized as the home of Black Strathcona, as an integral part of that community. Customers at Vi's included music legends like Louis Armstrong, Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington, Nat King Cole, and Vi made it a point to exclusively hire women. She wanted to give jobs to the women of her community. Nora Hendricks, grandmother to Jimi Hendrix, was a longtime cook, and we see her in this photo in the middle, the middle of the three women there. Vi's restaurant was a part of Hogan's Alley, and Hogan's Alley was a vibrant community of Black residents. It had a reputation for great music and cooking, as well as gambling and drinking. And the area was expropriated and demolished to make way for the Georgia Viaduct, which was completed in 1971. In recent years, members of Vancouver's Black community have initiated projects to revive the history of Hogan's Alley, sharing stories about standout residents like Vi Moore. There are so many amazing stories of the people who lived in this community in the time, and then the community was expropriated for the viaduct. There's a really great series on YouTube on Black Strathcona, and the section about Vi is told in poetry by one of her descendants. It's really cool. I recommend it. And we have seen all of our stops. We've reached the end of our tour. There are so many more stories that there are to share. And of course, there's new stories being made every day. You can find some of them on our walking tour app. As Donna talked about earlier, we've got this walking tour app. There's a number of different tours you can take. The Vancouver Women's Labor History is one of them, but there are more. And we are working on getting walking tours outside of the Vancouver area as well. I would really like to thank Janet Nickel, who I think is here with us today, who provided much of the original research for this presentation, as well as Bailey Garden, Pam Moody, Joey Hartman, and Allison Jones, whose research also really contributed.